Well, once we hit 30 minutes, I shut it down because that's my rule, right? I want people to like me. So
First of all, that's welcome back.
Welcome to the ReThink podcast.
Oh, there it is. What we were waiting for.
All your hopes and dreams will be dashed.
What episode is this?
We missed one last week, so I have no clue. It threw me off. I don't know.
The text was just that uncomfortable. People were asking us where the podcast was.
Yeah, I was actually very excited to do a podcast. I want to put this on record. I went to Stefan and I said, I'm ready to do a podcast. And then it got vetoed. So
About the boss?
It got shot down. I was ready to go.
Kind of like that balloon in the sky.
Or the 3 UFOs.
Hey, that's real, man.
Yeah.
That's real.
But yeah, so we're in Leviticus. Actually, last week, can I just recap?
Sure, go.
Because this is so amazing. Chapter 14 about the reinstatement into the community was a really powerful illustration of how God leaves heaven, sends his son Jesus to be our high priest, goes out and brings us back into the community of God and restores us, that he's the sacrifice, he's the one who cleanses us. And it's an amazing picture whenever you understand all the layers and depths of that chapter, because if you were outside the community, it was a death sentence. But yet the priest is the one who brings you back in that community when God does the work in your life. So
that's Ephesians right there, right?
Easy parallel to what Jesus does. Leaves heaven, comes to earth, brings us back into the community of God. He is the lamb that is sacrificed, that restores us not only to God but to the community, and reinstates our purpose into the community as well. So it was very exciting to me. I shared very passionately in Clay County about it.
Spirit in 30 minutes or less.
Well, once we hit 30 minutes, I shut it down because that's my rule, right? I want people to like me. So
First of all, that's weird in itself.
I wanted them to come back.
Oh, okay.
So if you
Not
can't
really
be
about
good,
you.
Yeah, if you can't be
you
good,
don't have
be
to prove
short.
yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
That is true. That's one of the 4 G's of the Gospels.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you want people to come back, and you can't hit them. You can't turn the fire hose on them for 30 minutes every single week and expect them to live. So it's about, really helping them stand firm, but also be able to stand up and come back. So that's where we were at last week. But that transitions perfectly because of the lamb that sacrificed reinstates to the community, to God, and purpose into the Day of Atonement. And that's where we're at this week.
Right.
I'm really excited about this one too.
So,
I'm not even preaching.
You're not?
No,
But you will right now.
I'm not. I'm going to let you lead this one.
Well, I was saying, actually, to start, I think you have to go back to where you begin this series when you were explaining the chiasm. You want to explain that again, people?
Yeah, well, I like to say chiasm because
it's the right way?
It's the key
Oh.
to the story or the picture.
This guy.
It just helps you be reminded of that a little easier. But anyway, it's pointing to the main focus of what's going on. And ultimately, Leviticus is about holiness. We have a holy God, and we have an unholy people. And there's got to be a process or a procedure that brings that together. So God dwells with his people, and his people can dwell in God's presence. And the first 7 chapters of Leviticus is all about the sacrifices. And it points to this idea of fellowship, being right with God in his holy community. But the only way that's accomplished is through the burnt offering for sin and the sin or the purification offering that makes us right or clean, because that's the clean, unclean sacrifice, and the atoning thing that makes us righteous or unrighteous. So we are cleansed and we are made clean and we are made right, justified before God through the burnt offering, specifically one time a year on the Day of Atonement.
Yeah. What's interesting to me about the chiasm here, this idea is that for me, I like to think of it like the tip of a spear. Like it is pointing everything to what's most important, and that's chapter 16.
Yep.
And so when we get to chapter 16, we've seen, as you've mentioned, like first 15 chapters, there is this sacrificial system. In chapters 17 and 27, this is the God's holy and perfect, and therefore he demands holy and perfect lives from his people, which is a problem, which is why he set up the Day of Atonement in the first place, a day to deal with the sins of his people. And so at this point in Israel's history, there is, by my count, our Jewish friend is probably going to tell me I'm wrong, but there are 6 holidays on the Jewish calendar at this point, and the Day of Atonement being the most important of them all, right? Is it?
That's rain.
That's me. That's God telling me I'm wrong.
What? Can you name the 6?
I cannot. I just read through them a couple days ago.
Passover, Pentecost, and Day of Atonement are the. Oh, and festivals.
Festivals.
Yeah. Festival of the Tabernacles.
I just know it's highlighted in Logos. So
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm trying to think of the other one. Okay.
But, I mean, I don't know. I would say Passover and Atonement are both...
equally as important.
I don't know. I would kind of make that argument. Because, like, Passover is what started the year. You know, that's what marked the...
Oh, did we say Pentecost?
Yeah, you did.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Like, Passover is what started their year for them and what, remembers the exodus from slavery. But then the Day of Atonement, is probably slightly more, like you said, than Passover, but they're both very, very important.
Yeah, this commentary said it was the most important day of the year for the Jewish people. And then it went into some details about, like, the things that God required on this day. So they were talking about how for the Jewish person they fast on this day, and they also don't work on this day, which we kind of talked about a little bit ago. But they were also required to basically stay in their tent and basically sit and pray and fast. And so I kind of thought about this through the lens of my weekend last weekend. Last weekend I was at a wedding, and I wasn't officiating the wedding. I was sitting in the crowd, and the preacher, who was my dad, just kept going and going and going.
That's a good preacher right there.
And he pushed over the 30-minute mark. And
is that where you get it from?
I think so. And so I'm sitting there, and my son's on my lap, and the goldfish bag just starts getting like lighter and lighter, and I'm like, we'd better hurry up, because when we run out of snacks, this party's over, And I was just thinking about it from the perspective of a parent. They're in their tent with their whole family, and they're supposed to fast and pray, and it would not take long for my kids to be like, hey, so where's the food? And then I was thinking about how, as a parent, I get the opportunity to use this as a moment to teach my kids we're sinners. And so it doesn't take long for the entire family unit to figure out very quickly, we are sinners, fallen short of God's glory, and because of that, something needs to die. And so they were aware, all of them, about what the cost of sin was going to cost the nation, right? That it had to be paid for. And so while they're in their tents, Aaron, as the high priest, is preparing for this day 7 days before the Day of Atonement.
Which also goes into their ordination piece. Right. Because they had to stay there at the
Did you talk about that in your... I can't remember.
I did. I
thought you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, like, so he's set apart, right? That's what he's symbolizing here. He's living close to the tabernacle. He's not talking to people. He's not interacting with people. He's not touching other people. He's beginning the process of all of these ceremonial baths. He's putting on the linens that are mentioned in chapter 16, and he's practicing going through the rituals that he will go through on the Day of Atonement. There's a thing I think that's really important too, is like he's practicing, he's not performing. Like this isn't a performance before God. This is something different. It's symbolizing the death of something to pay for sin. I also think it's interesting how he begins chapter 16, because it says the Lord comes to Moses and he reminds him of Aaron's sons who had come before God in chapter 10 in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I mean, the incense box blows up essentially, and they die. And because of that, God sets up this pattern for how the high priest is only to enter into God's presence one time a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so you read chapter 16, and if you're not careful, you can do what we do all through Leviticus. It can make it feel like it's confusing. It's not really confusing.
Right.
Right? So you have Aaron the high priest, 2 million-ish Israelites at this point in their tents, and he begins the process with a bull, with a ram, and 2 goats. He starts with the bull, and I used some pictures of the tabernacle and explained what was happening on that day. And so he would grab the bull, he would slit its throat, he would take the blood and catch it in a basin, and he would walk over to right outside of the tent at the altar, and there he would make a sweet aroma offering to the Lord. He would then go into the tabernacle, and there was the table of bread, there was the altar of incense, and there was something else, the lampstands.
Mm-hmm.
And he would set that bowl down. He would walk over to the table of incense. He would take coals and incense and put them in a bowl, and he would stick his hand through the veil, and he would fill that room up with smoke, right? And then he would walk back over and grab the bowl of blood from the bull, and he would walk in, and he would take the blood and he would put it on the mercy seat. Now, when we think Ark of the Covenant, we think like the whole thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. The Ark of the Covenant is just the actual bottom piece.
Right.
Inside of that is the 10 Commandments. The mercy seat is what's on top. He takes that blood, he puts it on the mercy seat, wipes it on there 7 times. 7 again, also super important. And then he essentially repeats the process with the goat. There's the whole scapegoat thing, right? Like one of them is sent into the wilderness. All of the sins are symbolically transferred onto that goat. Some scholars say that goat's killed. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't say that in the text, so I don't like to conclude to that.
Right. I was reading different opinions on it. I think you're exactly right. Like we can only teach what the text is teaching us, and that's where it leaves it.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just sent into the wilderness. I could keep going, but
so
what's
one of
your
the
thoughts?
things that I think is interesting in this process of the Day of Atonement is you were talking about Aaron getting like prepared to go in, and there's a sin offering that he has to do for himself
Right.
to begin this whole process. Then there's a sin offering that's done on behalf of the people.
The goat.
Well, no, not even then. It's just the clean, unclean
Oh, yeah.
process of getting basically like, okay, we're gonna make sure we're able to enter into God's presence. Then you have the scapegoat in there where there's this physical presentation of the pressing, it talks about like they would physically press down on the head of the goat, symbolizing this transfer of sin. Because
Aaron would, right?
yeah, and it's a picture for the people that all the sacrifices, and DeFazio points this out, is a lot of the sacrifices that are being done and the burnt offering that's going to be done
At the end.
at the end here for making you right with God is all done inside the veil. And so the goat is actually this physical representation of what it looks like for your sin to be cast out of the camp and sent out as far as possible. And once again, if you go back and you've been tracing this, sent out of camp is a death sentence. It's also a death sentence to death and sin. So it's saying we're sending this out of camp and it is no more. It does not exist, and God will deal with it. And that's how so it's this whole picture. And the whole smoke thing, I think, is really interesting too, because the Holy Holies, you go all the way back to like Moses, whenever he says, let me see you and all this stuff. And God's like, no, you can see my back, all this stuff. The smoke is this barrier for God's presence because he is ultimately holy in a sense that we can't even see without dying. And so the smoke enables, Aaron to even enter into the presence, but there's still this buffer. And I think that's something to be seen later on, because Jesus comes and he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, which is a huge deal in the sense because they're thinking like, how is this possible? And he's painting a picture for us even then into Revelation about when he opens the scrolls and like all things are set right, that there's going to be a day where there won't be incense or smoke in the barrier.
Yeah.
It'll be fully in his presence and wholly righteous, fully atoned for sin and made clean in his presence. And I think that's a really cool picture that Jesus plays on in the New Testament, but then a promise that we have that even right now, there's a veil in a sense, though we can enter into God's presence fully because of the Spirit, we don't see him in the sense of like physically see him, but one day we will live fully in his presence. I think that's really cool.
The thing with like Leviticus is like it's all about God trying to make a way for him to be in a relationship with his people. And so while this system, if you will, all of the things that went on during the Day of Atonement, while all of those things are good, they weren't great. And what I mean by that is like the main problem was at the very beginning when you said it, Aaron had to make a sacrifice for himself and for his family, communicating that the holiest dude among them is still a sinner.
Yep.
And so that's the problem, is the fact that their sin and they had to be dealt with. And you go to Hebrews chapter 10, and what you find out is that our high priest Jesus has no sin.
Right.
And so, Aaron is only allowed to go in the Holy of Holies one day a year. Well, Hebrews 7 says that because the grave could not hold the perfect lamb because he had not sinned, right? He is always interceding for us. Chapter 7, verse 25. It's like he literally, 1 Peter says he takes us before God.
Yep.
Like, because he is perfect and the perfect high priest, we are able to attach to his righteousness because we're not righteous. Like, that's the good news here.
Yeah. So Hebrews 7, 8, 9, and 10, the theme is better.
Right.
So we have a better high priest, we have a better tabernacle, and we have a better sacrifice.
The thing is like Jesus is the Ark of the Covenant. He is the tabernacle. He is all the fulfillment.
Yep.
Like, he is all these things that they put in place. And I think that's why Paul says over and over again in the New Testament, like, you can do all those religious things, but they're not going to save you.
Right.
It comes through attaching yourself to Christ through repentance. Once you do that.
So there's I don't want to, rehash mine from last week, but there's a process of being brought back in, right? So when Jesus says to his disciples, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men," he's actually doing possibly two different things there. He's calling them into a new identity and purpose, but to be restored in Leviticus, you had to follow the priest back in, and it's a declaration that he's ushering you back in to the community and back into God's presence. And so whenever we're talking about this, Jesus is better. He's called us to follow him. And that's the call we make as disciples, is we follow him. So it's this idea of attaching ourselves to him in every way possible. Not just in like, yes, I believe what he says,
but to actually follow him.
But to actually follow him back into the presence of God in every sense.
Yeah. I was just thinking about 1 Peter 3:18. It says that for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. And so we're the unrighteous right there, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. There's so much going on here. So, like, every single year, these people had to do the same thing. Because what they did after the Day of Atonement was they kept on sinning. And so, like, every single year, they're constantly being reminded of their shame and their guilt and their sin, but but they're being made aware of the fact that they can't be right.
It's almost like it's leaving you with the sense of, like, although it is making atonement, it's almost like it's not completely fulfilled. It's not completely lasting, and so it leaves you longing for something more, something better, which obviously what we've already talked about is Jesus.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. Well, and the whole, like, he says that he died once for sin, so there was no need for. Hebrews 10 talks about the fact that he doesn't need to die over and over and over again. Like he died one time and that was enough. So I don't know where I was going with that, but
Yeah, I don't know either. But it's interesting to me, even in Judaism, because the sacrificial system hasn't been in place since AD 70, destruction of the temple. And so, like, they've not been able to fulfill these laws. I think that's an interesting, like, dichotomy of just, they've made their own way now, even, of how to accomplish this righteousness, and they've become people of the book. So by studying God's word, but then also being benevolent in their actions, they've, quote unquote, accomplished these sacrifices. And I think that's pretty typical of humans in general, is like we try to find the workaround to make whatever we have available like the best. And I think that even points us to the fact that Jesus is so much more important. Like, we can't do it on our own. We can't give enough. We can't study enough. Jesus is the only one that gives peace, assurance, hope, and promise. So, anyway.
Yeah.
That's my Day of Atonement speech.
I don't know if you guys have been following. I've been really struck by this Asbury University thing. Whenever this is being played, I don't know if it'll still be going on, but essentially the story that's coming out about it is that on last Wednesday, so that would be, what date was last Wednesday?
The 9th.
The 8th.
8th, yeah.
The 8th. Since the 8th, that there have been this revival happening 24 hours a day. And you and I were talking about it, and it's not stopped, right? It's just continued to go. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this last night, and he was asking the question, okay, is this just a bunch of college kids that like want to skip school? like, hey, let's just stay in chapel forever.
Said no one.
If
you've ever been to a college chapel service.
Christian college chapel service.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about, like, how do you know that this is genuine and real? And you and I were talking about how one of the very first evidences of it being real is the fact that there is repentance that's happening. That there are people who are realizing that they're sinners, fallen short of God's glory, and they're remembering Romans 6, right? For the wages of sin is death. Something had to die. And we know that that's Jesus. And because of that, we can come to him and, again, attach ourselves to his righteousness, right? We're not, he is. He lived a life we couldn't live. And so I think that's part of the picture here, is like they were coming up with this system to pay for their sin. And while it was good, it wasn't great. It was the anticipation of the one who could pay the price.
Yep.
And so
I do want to clarify that they didn't come up with this system.
Right.
God gave it.
God gave it to
They're
them.
participating in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God seems to be a very big fan of hands-on learning. Like, not just telling them, what to do, but actually like involving us, his creation, in his will, in his plans. And so, as we involve and participate, then we learn what it looks like to follow him, to live him, and hopefully, see who he is as the one true God.
Yeah. The hands-on learning, I think, is super key. Like you said, like he's involving you in it, and you're getting to figure out who he is through it. So, anything else?
That's all I got to say about that.
Okay. You got anything else, Levi?
No, I'm good.
That's the most
Andrew stole everything. He just
Just.
I had one thing I wanted to say.
What was it? Go ahead.
No.
Oh, he already said it.
Yeah. It was the smoke. I made a connection while you were explaining that, and I was like, yes, that's awesome. And then Andrew just Went right into
Just
it.
took it over.
Sorry.
But it's fine. He said it better than I could.
I
so.
don't know about that.
You should have just interrupted him.
You should have. But hey, that's the most you've talked on the podcast. So congratulations. You got like more than 144 characters in it.
Yes.
I heard we can go 4,000 characters now on Twitter. So thank you, Elon.
All right. Well, join us next week when the boss is back. And we might be back. We might not be.
We'll see.
See ya.